The first time 3I ATLS spoke to us, nobody was listening. And that's the part that still keeps Eric awake at 3 in the morning. Not the alien part, not the government part, not even the part where the sky itself seemed to answer back. It's the silence. The way the universe cleared its throat for 5 straight minutes, and the only witness was a half-asleep graduate student in a windowless control room outside Socorro, New Mexico, scrolling on her phone while the data stacked up on a cold server 20 feet away. If you stay with me to the end of this story, you will never look at static or at those quiet gaps between notifications and news alerts in quite the same way again. Because the thing we call 3I ATLS was supposed to be harmless, a ghost stone from another star, a piece of cosmic debris just passing through. It was not supposed to answer back. It was not supposed to aim anything at us with the punctuality of a heartbeat and the precision of a metronome. And it definitely was not supposed to know how long 5 minutes is. On the night it really began, the Very Long Baseline Array Control Center looked like every other underfunded corner of American science, humming racks of equipment, a coffee machine that worked on the third try if you were gentle, whiteboards full of equations no one had erased in months because they looked too pretty. Eric had driven in from Albuquerque through a spill of desert darkness, the kind that makes you feel like the world ends 3 feet beyond your headlights. He was 43, too old to pretend he was still a young scientist, too young to accept that he'd probably never make the kind of discovery that got written up in textbooks. That night, he was just on call, backup, the one whose job was to be bored while the array quietly recorded the sky. Out at the dishes, spread across New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and beyond, the antennas were pointed not at Atlas but at a quasar they used for calibration, a bright, distant lighthouse in the radio fog. Atlas was just an opportunistic tag-along in the schedule, a side project, riding on the coattails of real science. 3I ATLS, third known interstellar object to pass through our solar system, smaller than Oumuamua, faster than 2I Borisov, a spectacular blip for PowerPoint slides and science news feeds 2 years ago, now already fading into the long tail of things the public once cared about. It had swung through the inner system and was on its way out, a cold stone speeding toward the dark. Nothing about it should have changed. At 0112 local time, the software flagged a transient. It was polite about it, a yellow banner at the bottom of a monitoring screen that read, "Anomalous signal detected, review recommended." No alarm, no red flashing lights, just another line of text in a room wallpapered with data. The grad student on shift, Rosa, glanced at it, yawned, and dragged the window open. Her log later would show the exact entries. 0113, transient spurious, probably RFI, tagging for later review. RFI, radio frequency interference, earth noise. Cell towers, satellites, air traffic control, somebody's trucker radio, somebody's microwave. The universe is loud with us. It's always easier to blame the planet than the sky. The transient itself looked like a thick band of noise that rose out of the background for exactly 5 minutes and then vanished as if someone had closed a door. It was broadband, spread across the whole observing band, like a sudden hush or a sudden shout, depending on how you plotted it. Rosa clicked through the diagnostic panels. The antennas were fine, the quasar signal was fine, no storms, no solar flare alerts, no known satellites crossing the field of view. She shrugged, logged it, and went back to the quasar. The dishes kept listening. The servers kept recording. No one woke Eric. In the morning, driving back along I-25 with the desert turning gold and the radio muttering soft country songs, Rosa mentioned it in passing. "We had a weird spike last night," she said, scrolling through her tablet. Probably another stupid Starlink reflection. I tagged it for you." Eric grunted by way of thanks. The word weird didn't move the needle for him anymore. Weird was the job. Weird was the noise you sifted through forever, hoping one day it would arrange itself into something that made sense. He didn't open the file until that afternoon. After the meetings, after the email storms, after a bitter cup of coffee he told himself would be his last caffeine of the day. The recording came up as a simple gray waterfall plot. Time on one axis, frequency on the other, intensity in shades from black to white. And there it was. 5 minutes of wrongness. Each 5-second slice looked like a smear of evenly spread static, but when Eric leaned in, when he adjusted the scaling, a subtle pattern emerged. Faint bands marching through the noise at a shallow angle, like ghost lines on an old TV. Regular, structured. The hairs rose on the back of his neck before his conscious brain caught up, before he started running the usual tests. Was it in all antennas? Was it stronger in some? Was it localized in direction or everywhere? The answers lined up too neatly. Yes, all antennas saw it. No, it wasn't the same everywhere. When he synthesized the signals into a virtual beam and aimed it at the sky, the source popped out like a pin on a map. It was coming from the patch of space where 3I ATLS should have been, according to JPL's ephemeris, within the margin of error of a few arcseconds. A few arcseconds in the sky is like finding a voice coming from exactly one window in a city of 1,000,000. Most of the time, that means someone's home. Eric sat back, feeling his pulse pick up. He said out loud, Okay, no need to get dramatic, it's just one spike. Comet spit radio noise. Planets hiss. The sun crackles. Atlas was a rock, but maybe some plasma interaction, some odd geometry of dust and solar wind had thrown off a transient. Space did strange things all the time without consulting his expectations. He checked the timing. 300 seconds, give or take a fraction. The amplitude rose smoothly, plateaued, then dropped off like a switch. Too clean. Most natural phenomena are messy, smeared, fuzzed by chaos. This thing felt engineered. He hated that word. It was the word UFO blogs loved. Engineered, designed, intelligent. Words that turned careful scientists into bad storytellers. He closed the file. Opened it again. Ran a Fourier transform, stripping away the broadband noise to see if there was any narrow structure hidden inside. The noise resisted, stubborn and even, but underneath it he caught a faint heartbeat of power at regular intervals, a tiny rise every 1.337 seconds. That number meant nothing, except that it stuck in his head like a song. After an hour, he did what any responsible scientist is supposed to do. He tried to prove it was nothing. He checked other facilities. The VLA had been on a different target. A small amateur array outside Flagstaff had been down for maintenance. No corroboration. No way to tell if this was a local glitch or a sky event. He dumped the data into the anomaly folder and told himself he'd get back to it. He didn't sleep well that night. 2 days later, the signal came back. This time, Rosa wasn't alone. There were 3 people in the control room, a visiting engineer doing a firmware test, and the kind of quiet you get when everyone is pretending not to be annoyed that they're working on a Friday evening. At 19:04, the yellow banner flickered again. Anomalous signal detected, review recommended. Rosa's eyes snapped to it like a reflex. She'd been a kid during the last real wow signal scare, but she'd grown up on YouTube clips and docuseries about it. Somewhere deep in her brain, neurons fired ancient little fireworks. This is how those stories start. She pulled it up on the main screen. The engineer whistled softly. "That's clean," he said. The transient looked almost identical to the first one. 5 minutes of broadband elevation, the same faint diagonal bands, the same smooth rise and fall. Same beam direction. They checked the ephemeris. Atlas, farther out now, a little dimmer, still right there in the crosshairs. This time Rosa called Eric before she tagged it and moved on. He was in his kitchen in Albuquerque, elbows deep in dishwater, his phone buzzing on the counter. He let it go to voicemail, saw her name, and something in his chest tightened. He dried his hands and called back. "Hey," he said. "Are you alive?" She said yeah, but her voice had that brittle edge he'd learned to respect. "We've got another one. Same direction, same shape, 5 minutes on the nose."
On the nose? To the second. I checked. He felt the world tilt a little. "Record everything," he said, though of course the system was already doing that. "Run system self-checks. Log the hell out of it. I'm on my way." The drive out to the control center had never felt so long. The desert outside the windows might as well have been empty space. Somewhere overhead, invisible in the bright afternoon sky, a rock from another star was sliding away from them at tens of kilometers per second, and something about that rock had chosen to throw 5 minutes of structured noise in their direction twice. By the time he walked into the control room, the 5 minutes were over. The signal had vanished. The screens showed ordinary cosmic static again, as if nothing had happened. But the logs were full. Rosa had done what he'd asked. Every diagnostic, every health check, all clean. No glitches, no local interference flagged by the automated systems. Eric pulled the data into his laptop, fingers moving faster than he'd like to admit. Layered the two events atop each other. If they were local, unrelated glitches, they shouldn't match. Natural phenomena rarely repeat so perfectly either. But here, the resemblance was unnerving. The spectral shape was nearly identical. The faint diagonal structures lined up. The timing was exact. 300.00 seconds start to finish, within the clock's precision. "Could be some terrestrial signal bouncing off the object," the engineer offered, hovering behind him. "Like a radar echo sort of thing." "Maybe," Eric said, "except we're not pinging it with anything. And if this were a reflection, we'd see a faint version of the original signal shape. This thing is flat in time and fat in frequency. It's not echoing us, it's doing its own thing." He didn't say what he really thought, the sentence forming in the back of his mind like a dangerous crystal. "It's on a schedule." They filed a report, the sanitized kind that went first to the observatory director and then, through a series of quiet channels, to an office in Pasadena whose mailing address was JPL and whose real destination list was longer and stranger. Interstellar object, repeat broadband transient, possible association, further monitoring recommended. No one used the word message. No one dared. The universe was full of ways to embarrass yourself. For a week, they got nothing. Atlas moved on, the line of its trajectory creeping outward on their sky maps. The dishes followed it when they could, slipping in a few minutes of track time between more official targets. Every observing block Rosa scheduled felt like she was calling a number in some cosmic roulette game. 0, 0, 0. Then, on a Wednesday just after midnight, the yellow banner popped up again. Third time, 5 minutes. Same shape, same direction. This time, Eric was in the control room, half dozing in a cheap rolling chair with an empty paper coffee cup balanced on his knee. As the banner appeared, Rosa nudged him hard enough to spill it. "You're going to want to see this," she said. They had rehearsed what they would do. Now they did it. They split the observing band into as many narrow channels as the system would handle. They pointed a second, smaller array, an old set of dishes usually used for student projects, at the same coordinates. They logged system clocks, GPS streams, even power line fluctuations. The signal didn't care. It rose like a tide, peaked, and fell away, right on time, exactly like the others. As soon as it ended, Eric pushed back from the console, heart hammering. "Okay," he said. "We're past coincidence. We're past random. This thing is on a cadence." 5 minutes, Rosa said softly. Why 5 minutes? Because it's short enough that we can fit it into our schedule and long enough to drive us crazy, the engineer muttered. Eric barely heard him. He was already thinking in rhythms, in clocks. 5 minutes is 300 seconds. At the speed of light, that's about 90 million kilometers. He thought of light echoes, radar pings, orbital periods. Nothing landed. They analyzed the third burst through the night. Under the broad noise envelope, under the faint diagonal striations, the tiny 1.337-second heartbeat was there again, stronger now with more data to stack. When they folded the signal at that interval, a pulse profile emerged. Not a sharp spike like a pulsar, but a smooth undulation, like someone slowly turning a dimmer knob up and down. It looked like modulation, intent. Eric stared at it until his eyes blurred. Maybe it's just natural maser activity, the director suggested on a bleary Zoom call at dawn. Some gas cloud near the object, some plasma effect. Until we see narrowband structure, we can't talk about encoding. We've got narrowband structure, Rosa said quietly. She'd been working while the older scientists argued. On a secondary monitor, she pulled up a new plot. Time on one axis, the folded pulse phase on the other. Instead of random noise, the brightness formed a ladder of little squares, on and off, in a pattern that marched across the 5 minutes like soldiers on parade. I binned the intensity, she said. Look, high, low, high, low. It's not just a wave, it's discrete. It's digital. The word hung there. Digital. On, off. Ones and zeros buried in a radio hiss from an object that had come from another star, rushed past our sun, and was now receding into the dark while dropping 5-minute breadcrumbs behind it. The director rubbed his temples. Before anyone says what we're all thinking, we need confirmations, other observatories, independent analysis. I already sent a heads up to Greenbank, unofficial. If they see the same thing, we're not crazy. He didn't say the other half of the sentence. If they don't, we are. Greenbank did see it. So did a small dish in Puerto Rico run by a SETI nonprofit, and an aging antenna in Puerto Rico that the world thought was retired, but still listened on good nights when the wind wasn't too bad. The next burst came almost exactly 48 hours later. Same 5 minutes, same broadband hump, same 1.337-second cadence. By then, there were more eyes on the data than Eric was comfortable with. A quiet request from a partner agency had gone out, and suddenly there were encryption layers on the servers and visitor badges at the control room door. The thing about secrets is they don't feel real until you hear the word clearance. The thing about science is it dies in the dark. For a week, Eric lived between those two truths. The team worked in shifts, sleeping in spare offices, living on pizza and caffeine, carving the 5-minute windows into thinner and thinner slices. The ladder of highs and lows in the folded pulse profile grew clearer. It wasn't random. It wasn't weather. It wasn't an echo. They started writing it down as a string. H for high, L for low, just to see. HLL, HHL, HHHLL. It meant nothing, until Rosa had the idea that changed everything. A stupid, obvious, brilliant idea that, in retrospect, feels like the moment the universe leaned in a little closer. What if we're binning it wrong? She said at 3 in the morning. Her eyes ringed and red, her hair in a messy knot. We're assuming the 1.33-second thing is the fundamental unit. What if it's not? What if that's just the carrier and the real pattern's slower? She rebinned the data, grouping pulses into blocks. 2 at a time. 3. 4. At 8, something snapped into place. The H's and L's resolved into a series of groups where only the first few positions ever went high. It looked like a histogram, a count. Eric felt the world narrow to the cursor on the screen. 8 bins. Highs only in the first few per block. The counts climbed and reset with a regularity that had nothing to do with plasma or gas clouds or masers. "What are you counting?" he whispered to the clock, to Atlas, to the invisible thing out there in the dark. The answer, when it came, was simple. Horribly simple. Rosa overlaid timestamps on the blocks. The counts lined up with the previous bursts, with their own observations, with the distance estimates to Atlas calculated from its trajectory. The signal wasn't counting in seconds. It was counting in light seconds, in distance. Every burst was a 5-minute status report on how far Atlas was from the sun, encoded in a crude ladder-like bar chart riding under the noise. "It's telling us where it is," she said. Like it thinks it can't see us." Eric's throat had gone dry. "No," he said slowly. "Not where it is, where it thinks it is." That was the moment they crossed a line they could never uncross. Up until then, Atlas had been a rock, maybe doing something interesting with gas and dust and fields. Now, in a cramped room in New Mexico, 3 exhausted humans stared at a plot on a screen and entertained a different possibility. That there was something on or in or orbiting 3i Atlas that not only knew how far it was from our sun, but cared enough to report it every 48 hours in 5-minute bursts, using a clock that never slipped by more than a fraction of a second. For a long time, no one said anything. Outside, the desert lay under a thin rising moon. Overhead, the sky turned slowly, indifferent. In the data, the 5-minute windows stacked up like numbered pages in a book they were just beginning to learn how to read. Later, much later, people would argue about when the contact really happened. Some would say it wasn't a contact at all, just an artifact, a misunderstanding. Others would insist the real moment was still to come, in a burst we haven't decoded yet. But if you ask Eric, if you catch him on one of those sleepless nights when he's honest enough to admit how much of his life is now divided into before and after, he'll tell you it happened right there, in that cramped control room, when a pattern in the noise resolved into a simple, chilling fact. The object we thought was just passing through had found a way to talk about itself, and that meant sooner or later it might find a way to talk about us.
When the 4th burst arrived, it didn't feel like a discovery anymore. It felt like a deadline. For 48 hours, the team had been living inside a kind of suspended breath, a tension that never relaxed, the air in the control center permanently tight like the room itself understood something was coming and was bracing for impact. By the time the yellow alert banner blinked under the top monitor again, anomalous signal detected, review recommended, everyone was already staring at the clock. 19:04:12. The burst began exactly when the model predicted. Reality is never that cooperative. Natural phenomena don't sync to spreadsheets and countdowns. But this did. Eric had stopped trying to make jokes about it 2 days ago. That was when the calls started, first politely from Pasadena, then curtly from someone who didn't give a name and didn't need to. Nobody said classified, but the tone said it for them. They wanted raw data, timestamps, calibration logs. They wanted the team to keep quiet, to route everything through secure channels, to pretend nothing unusual was happening in a control room that smelled of stale pizza and cold coffee. But the universe wasn't cooperating with them either, because the 4th burst wasn't just another 5-minute block of strange noise. It was the first one that answered back. The instant the signal rose above background, Rosa hit the pipeline that split the spectrum into its finest slices. The engineer triggered the time domain folding script. Eric locked the dish orientation to the moving target with barely a millisecond of lag. Everything they had prepared, everything they had rehearsed, snapped into place. And then the data began to pour in, a bright, swelling plateau of broadband intensity, the faint diagonal bands,
the 1.337-second heartbeat pulsing beneath it all, a familiar face returning. But that's where the familiarity ended, because this time the heartbeat wasn't alone. As soon as Eric folded the signal across the cadence, the ladder pattern appeared, the same rising bars counting distance in light seconds, climbing and resetting in a neat arc. That part made sense now. It was the baseline they expected. But beneath that ladder, weaker, almost swallowed in noise, something else flickered into view, a second structure, faint but rhythmic, like the echo of an echo. "Hold on," Eric muttered, leaning closer to the screen. "What is that?" Rosa frowned, increasing the dynamic range. It sharpened. A set of pulses, narrow, concentrated, not broadband, not random. Narrowband modulation inside a broadband envelope was like whispering during a scream, deliberate, controlled. "Is it instrumental noise?" the engineer said, already running a self-check. Eric shook his head. Noise doesn't repeat every 48 hours from the same point in the sky. He highlighted the new structure and ran a frequency analysis. The line came back clean and terrifyingly simple. A repeating sequence of tones, spaced exactly according to prime number ratios. 2 pulses, pause. 3 pulses, pause. 5 pulses, pause. 7, 11, 13. The first 6 primes. The universe had just cleared its throat in mathematics, the only language anyone, anywhere should be able to understand. Rosa whispered, "Oh my God." The engineer muttered, "That's impossible." Eric just stared. Prime members are the calling card, the thing SETI teams dream of their entire careers, a universal handshake, a way to say, "I'm not nature, I'm someone." But the horror of it wasn't that Atlas was sending primes. The horror was that it wasn't sending all primes, only some. The small ones, the obvious ones, the ones we send. There are a handful of well-known artificial signals humanity has broadcast into deep space, intentionally or accidentally. Test transmissions, calibration pulses, SETI beacons from decades ago, messages sent out of hope or boredom or ambition. Many of them used simple prime number sequences. The narrowband pattern in the 4th burst matched one of those sequences almost note for note. The Arecibo-style calibration test used in the early 2000s, a tiny, almost forgotten piece of radio housekeeping that no one outside a very small scientific community even remembered.
"It's reflecting us," Salma said softly. "No," Eric said, "not reflecting, repeating." The distinction mattered. A reflection is immediate. A repeat takes time. It meant Atlas had heard us before, a long time before. He opened the archival logs from Green Bank, Arecibo, old SETI scans from the early 2000s. After 2 hours of digging, the source became clear. Atlas was echoing a transmission from 2003 that had been aimed not at the stars, but at the moon during a calibration sweep. It was never meant to go anywhere. It wasn't aimed into deep space, yet somehow, across the gulf between solar systems, Atlas had caught it. The team fell silent as the implications sank in. For Atlas to replay a transmission from 2003, it meant 2 things. First, it had been listening. Second, it had been near enough to intercept Earth-directed emissions so faint they tend to disappear within a few astronomical units. That meant Atlas hadn't come from nowhere. It hadn't simply drifted into the inner solar system. It had passed near Earth before, or near something that emitted Earth signals. "That's not possible," the engineer said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Eric ran the numbers anyway. Signal strength attenuation over distance, background noise, cosmic interference.
The probability that a tiny rock from another star could intercept and store a weak calibration pulse meant for the Moon was essentially zero, which meant Atlas was not a passive receiver. It wasn't an accidental listening post. Whatever was inside that broadband noise had ears. The fourth burst continued. The prime sequence repeated twice, then cut off sharply. The ladder of light-second counts ended exactly on schedule. 5 minutes. Clean, consistent, intentional. When the signal dropped, none of them moved for several seconds. The sudden silence felt like stepping into an airlock after a pressure leak. Then the world rushed back in, the hum of servers, the distant echo of someone dropping a metal cart in the hallway, Rose's shaky exhale. Eric finally said what they were all thinking. We need to tell them. The director was on the line within minutes. He listened without interrupting, without sighing, without the usual bureaucratic noise. When Eric described the primes, the director closed his eyes. When he described the match to the 2003 calibration pulse, the director's posture stiffened. You are not, he said carefully, to mention that detail outside this call. Understood? Understood, Eric said, though the words tasted bitter. The director's voice softened slightly. You've done good work, but this can't leak, not yet. Send the raw data, not the processed files. We'll take it from here. The call ended. The silence returned. The team exchanged looks that said everything. We're losing control of this, and worse, maybe we never had it. For 2 days they heard nothing, no updates, no acknowledgments. Atlas moved onward, a silent stone gliding toward the edge of the solar system and taking its secrets with it. The team slept in shifts again. They ate whatever was left in the vending machines. They hovered near the monitors like nervous parents waiting for a heartbeat. And on the next predicted window, 48 hours to the second, the fifth burst arrived. This one was different from the moment it began. The broadband hump was stronger, louder, almost aggressive. It rose faster than before, as though Atlas were leaning closer, speaking louder, insisting on being heard. The diagonal bands sharpened. The heartbeat was clearer, and beneath it, the narrow-band tone sequence was no longer just primes. It was layered, complex, a stack of frequencies like the harmonic structure of a human voice, except no voice could ever sound like this.
Is that modulation sidebanding? Rosa asked, squinting. It looks like speech. It did. It really unmistakably did. Except not speech the way we produce it. Not through lungs and throats and tongues. This looked like a compressed spectrogram. Like someone had analyzed human voices, flattened them, squeezed them, replayed only the bare skeleton of their sound. Eric ran the inverse transform. The shape sharpened. The structure clarified. What emerged was a sound file, tiny, compressed, full of artifacts, but undeniably patterned, like a voice. A voice that wasn't alien. A voice that wasn't new. It was Earth's voice. Specifically, a scrambled, distorted, hollowed-out fragment of a decades-old radio broadcast. A human voice reading the news. Good evening, this is... and then static swallowed the rest. Eric recognized the cadence immediately. It was the kind of generic broadcast millions of Americans used to fall asleep to in the early 2000s. He felt his stomach twist. It's replaying us, he said. It's replaying Earth. Rosa zoomed out. More pieces appeared. Snippets of song, background noise, faint digital artifacts. It was like someone had taken a giant net through the ocean of human radio history and pulled it back full of scraps, fragments of everything we had ever sent into space, all mixed together, flattened,
filtered, compressed down to the bare signal skeleton. Not alien, not ours anymore either. Something in between. Something that had been listening for much, much longer than anyone thought possible. "How long has Atlas been hearing us?" Rosa whispered. "Before it got here? Before Oumuamua? Before we even knew what it was?" That question hung over them like a storm cloud. The fifth burst wasn't over. At the 4-minute mark, the signal shifted again, suddenly, violently, like a radio changing channels. A new structure appeared, denser, sharper, unmistakably artificial. It looked like a data stream, encoded, blocky, purposeful. The kind of compression used in early digital communications. The team froze. The engineer leaned in and whispered, That looks like military." Eric felt the blood drain from his face. He recognized the signature too. He had worked briefly on a contract years ago that involved analyzing secure transmissions. He knew the shape. It was a classified U.S. Navy digital mode used between 1999 and 2010. It should not be in deep space. It should not be inside the Atlas signal. It should not be anywhere except archived in servers buried under concrete and steel. But there it was. Tiny, degraded, but real. Atlas had intercepted and replayed a transmission that should never have left Earth. Now the horror was no longer theoretical. It was practical, political, dangerous. "Turn it off," the engineer whispered. "Delete it. Don't save it." "We don't delete data," Eric said, his voice shaking. "We don't lie." "This isn't science anymore," the engineer hissed. "This is national security." Rosa looked between them. "It's already saved. It saves automatically. Too late." Eric's inbox pinged. A new email. No sender, no subject, just a single line. "Stop analyzing. Send raw data only. Do not decode." Before he could react, the control room phone rang. It wasn't the director. It wasn't anyone they recognized. The voice on the other end was calm, controlled, and absolutely not a scientist. "Dr. Hale, cease all processing immediately. Secure your local drives. We're sending a team. Do not discuss the latest transmission with anyone outside the facility. Do you understand?" Eric closed his eyes. "We understand." The line went dead. The team stared at him. "They can't just take this," Rosa whispered. "They will," Eric said. "They already have." Outside, the desert night pressed against the windows like a held breath. The signal was over. The room was silent again. But the damage had been done. Atlas had spoken in a language no one expected. A mirror, a memory, a recording of us, gathered in the dark and thrown back across the void. The fifth burst changed everything. Because now the team wasn't asking, is something inside Atlas intelligent? They were asking, how much of us has it already heard? And the question that came next, the one no one wanted to say out loud, was worse by far. What is it waiting to replay next? The next 48 hours would bring an answer none of them were prepared for, and it would be the first time Atlas said something that wasn't from our past, but from our future. The 48 hours leading into the sixth burst didn't feel like time. They felt like pressure. Like someone had stretched the world thin and everything underneath was starting to show through the cracks. Armed security arrived first. 2 unmarked SUVs rolling up the access road in silence. The kind of silence that made your skin crawl because you knew it was deliberate. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't flash badges. They simply walked in, took seats at the back of the control room, and watched. Not the screens, not the instruments, the people. Eric tried to focus, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling of being measured, dissected, cataloged like data points instead of human beings. Rosa worked without speaking, her hands trembling just enough to betray what she refused to say out loud. The engineer, who used to make sarcastic comments about everything, didn't speak at all. He just stared at the floor as though trying to convince himself that he hadn't recognized the digital signature inside the fifth burst, that he hadn't whispered a curse under his breath when the narrowband pattern aligned with a classified codebase. The sixth burst window crept closer, the clock digits turning red as if bleeding out the last seconds of normalcy. 1859-50. 1859-55. And then, like a knife sliding into a lock, 190000. The signal hit instantly. No soft rise, no gentle swell, a spike. Clean, vertical, perfect. As though Atlas had been waiting to speak the moment Earth was capable of listening. The broadband body erupted across the spectrum in a way none of them had seen before. It wasn't just noise. It had texture now. Contours, ridges, like fingerprints pressed into static. The heartbeat remained at 1.33 seconds, but now carried harmonic overtones, subtle distortions that fluttered like wings. The ladder of light-second increments returned, but it didn't reset at the usual time. It kept climbing. 40 seconds. 50 seconds. 60 seconds. "It's extending the range," Rosa murmured, eyes locked to the screen. "Why? Why now?" No one answered. At the back of the room, one of the men in suits murmured something into his sleeve. And then the narrowband core ignited. A torrent of tones poured into the pipeline, the modulation pattern more complex than anything prior. It wasn't speech. It wasn't echoes. It wasn't memory. It was structured, purposeful. It looked like code. "This isn't a replay," Eric said. "This is new." The data blocks stacked in clean rectangular bursts, compressed, repeated, and then altered, like something was adjusting in real time. Each block contains slight variations, tiny shifts in phase, amplitude, frequency, as if Atlas was sending multiple versions of the same message to see which one Earth could decode. "Adaptive signaling," the engineer whispered, awe breaking through fear. "It's calibrating to us." But the horror came not from what Atlas was doing. It came from what the data contained. As Rosa magnified the blocks, the internal pattern appeared. Temporal markers. Not timestamps in the human sense, no date, no time of day formatting. These were probabilistic timestamps based on predicted system states. Earth system states. Satellite positions, orbital corrections, sunspot intensity forecasts, weather pattern trajectories, seismic probabilities. But not from now. From tomorrow. From the next day. From next week. Is this prediction data? Rosa said, her voice barely audible. "It's impossible," the engineer muttered, but he sounded like he was trying to convince himself again. The sixth burst continued. The blocks kept coming. The modifications kept evolving. Every 30 seconds, Atlas updated the prediction set, as though Atlas was comparing reality to its own model. But that was insane. That required real-time observation, direct feedback. It meant the object wasn't just broadcasting blindly into space. It was watching Earth. Eric overlaid the predicted orbital adjustments of several satellites with the current tracking logs from NASA's feed. His stomach lurched.
"Oh, God," he breathed. "They match." Rosa leaned in. "Define match. The predicted corrections are within error bars of the actual ones. And not old data. These corrections were scheduled for next week." The engineer paled. "How the hell would it know that?" The men in suits exchanged a look. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition, as if the sixth burst had just confirmed something they already feared, something they hadn't shared with the scientists because they didn't trust them or because they didn't want the scientists to panic. At 4 minutes 17 seconds into the burst, everything changed. The data block stopped, the ladder froze, the broadband pattern collapsed inward,
and then the narrowband channel, so delicate, so subtle in previous bursts, erupted into a piercing, concentrated tone. "That's a carrier beam," the engineer said, voice cracking. "It's wiping all other modulation. Why?" The tone shifted, flattened, wavered, and then the audio began. The first sound wasn't words. It was wind, heavy rushing wind like a storm crawling across an empty plain. Then a distant metallic groan. Then the unmistakable rumble of something deep and geological, the kind of sound Earth makes when it's angry. Rosa froze. "That's seismic." The audio deepened. A crack, a roar, then the sharp, hollow thud of something collapsing. Eric's breath caught in his throat as recognition hit him like a fist. "This is a recording." "Of what?" Rosa said. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The engineer grabbed the waveform, ran a spectral analysis, eyes darting across the screen. The surface resonance, the frequency. That's not just seismic nunnies, that's buildings, that's structures failing. A quiet settled in the room, a quiet that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with no ground beneath your feet. The audio continued. Sirens, a type used in several coastal U.S. cities. Then a faint voice, distorted, distant, but unmistakably human, shouting something drowned out by the roar. Rosa clapped a hand over her mouth. "Is this from the future?" Eric forced himself to steady his voice. "No, it can't be. We don't even know that's Earth." But he wasn't convinced. No one was. The sixth burst was almost over. The broadband spectrum began to collapse, the heartbeat slowing like a fading pulse, the narrowband tone tapering into a thin filament of sound. And then, 5 seconds before the burst ended, Atlas sent one final block, a tiny one, barely detectable, a compressed packet almost small enough to ignore. The engineer opened it, and the room went cold. It was coordinates. Earth coordinates, precisely formatted in decimal latitude-longitude. And they weren't random. They pointed to a coastline, to a specific U.S. city, to a date, a time, exactly 17 days in the future. One of the men in suits stepped forward so quickly his chair toppled backward. He said, "Shut it down." Not to Eric, to Rosa, to the engineer, to the entire room. "This transmission is now classified at the highest level. You are forbidden to analyze, store, or discuss any part of the sixth burst without authorization. You will surrender all local storage devices immediately." "You can't do that," Rosa said, stepping back. "We're scientists. We're supposed to—" "This is not science. This is threat assessment." Eric tried to reason with him. "If Atlas predicted a disaster, we need to verify." "No one is verifying anything," he said. "You will follow orders." His tone was final, absolute, the kind of tone that made disobedience feel like a death sentence. The men began collecting drives, laptops, backups, even private notebooks. The control room felt smaller by the second, suffocating, violated. And then, something happened that no one expected. The engineer, usually the quietest, most rule-abiding person in the room, suddenly placed a hand on the back of his workstation. His movements were slow, casual, almost dismissive. But Eric caught it. The engineer was ejecting a micro SD card from a hidden port. He slid it into his sleeve with the smallest flick of his wrist. The security officers were too busy confiscating the main drives to see it. Eric's heartbeat kicked so hard he thought it might crack a rib. When had the engineer started doing that? How long had he been preparing for the possibility of data seizure? Had he always suspected things might reach this point? No time to ask, no way to acknowledge it. One wrong look could expose everything. When the room was finally stripped of hardware, one of the officers sealed the evidence case and said in a low voice, "For your own safety, do not attempt to reconstruct the lost data. Do not discuss the details of Burst 6, and above all, do not speculate about its origin or intent. You won't like the consequences." They left without another word. The door shut, the windows rattled, and then the silence returned. Not just any silence, the kind that fills a room after something irreversible has happened. Rosa sank into a chair. "They can't stop us from thinking," she whispered. "No," Eric said, staring at the blank monitors, "but they can stop us from knowing." The engineer finally spoke. "Only if they took everything," he said softly. "They didn't." He revealed the micro SD card, no larger than a fingernail, holding the entire decrypted core of the sixth burst. "We need to get out of here," the engineer said, "tonight." Rosa nodded. "Where?" "Somewhere they won't look. Somewhere offline." They piled into Eric's car, a dusty old SUV with cracked leather seats and no built-in telemetry. The stars hung over the desert like frozen sparks. For once, none of them looked at the sky. They drove into the night with no headlights for a solid mile, just in case. They didn't know where they were going, only that they were running out of time. And as they wound down the narrow road towards the highway, Eric looked at the clock glowing on the dashboard. 17 days. The question gnawed at him. Had Atlas predicted a disaster, or had it warned them about one? Or, worst of all, was it planning to cause one? The radio crackled, not with music, not with static, but with a tone. Sharp, clean, familiar. 1.337 seconds. Rosa screamed, the engineer swore. The signal wasn't coming from the dish, it wasn't coming from the sky, it was coming from inside the car. The cabin filled with the same cadence they had spent nights decoding, the same heartbeat Atlas had played for them again and again. Except this time it wasn't broadband, it wasn't coded, it was a message, a single modulated whisper, scraped raw by cosmic distance, but unmistakably shaped with intent. Eric slammed the brakes, gravel spat, the SUV skidded to a stop in the middle of the deserted road. The tone repeated. Then, through distortion, through noise, through terror, they heard words. A human voice. Their own voice. Eric's voice, saying a sentence he had never spoken in his life, a sentence no one should hear themselves say from the future. "Don't go back to the facility." Rosa's breath hitched. "Eric, that was you." The engineer's hands shook violently. "It's replaying us again." But it wasn't a replay. Not this time. Something far worse. The next words came through clearly, spoken in Eric's voice, but older, rougher, strained, like a version of him worn thin by fear. "It's already inside." Then the transmission cut. The desert fell silent. Atlas had just sent them a recording from the future. And whatever future it came from, they weren't in the facility anymore. Not alive. The sixth burst wasn't a warning. It was a timeline. And now they had 17 days to figure out which one they were living in.
They didn't speak for the first 10 minutes after the transmission ended. The desert swallowed the silence, the world holding its breath with them, as if even the wind didn't want to interrupt whatever realization was clawing its way into their minds. The SUV idled on the dusty road, engine ticking softly like a dying heartbeat. Eric stared straight ahead, hands white on the wheel, unable to process the sound of his own voice echoing back from a future he had never lived. Rosa kept replaying it in her head, those 6 words that didn't belong in any reality she understood. And the engineer, usually unshakable in his logic, looked like someone had scooped out the inside of his certainty and left only the shell. Finally, Eric forced words out. "We're not going back." Rosa nodded, but the motion was lifeless, like her body was moving on instinct while her mind lagged several steps behind. "The question is," the engineer murmured, "then where the hell do we go?" They drove with no plan except distance. The micro SD card sealed inside the engineer's jacket like a radioactive seed. It felt heavier than anything its size had a right to be. The desert eventually vomited them onto the interstate, where lonely semi-trucks thundered past like migrating beasts. The farther they got from the facility, the more a new dread grew.
the dread of realizing Atlas had followed them. Or maybe it had never needed to follow them, because it had always been inside whatever timeline was unfolding. They kept the radio off, afraid it might speak again. When they finally stopped, it was in a small motel off Route 54 in New Mexico, the kind with flickering signs and sun-faded murals of cowboys. The night clerk barely looked up as they took a room. The walls were thin, the air conditioner groaning like something trapped inside it wanted out. They triple-checked that no device in the room had connectivity. No smart TV, no smart thermostat, no wireless speaker. They pulled the battery from the alarm clock, just in case. For the first time since burst 6, they allowed themselves to breathe. "All right," Rosa said, clearing space on the room's rickety table. "Let's look at the data." The engineer shook his head. "No, not here. Not on anything connected to anything. We need to go full analog for extraction." He pulled out a toolkit from his backpack. Tiny screwdrivers, a custom reader he'd printed himself, a shielding sleeve. "This won't connect to any network, not even power. Pure battery." Eric couldn't shake the feeling that they were doing something treasonous. And maybe they were. But after hearing his own voice warning them from somewhere impossible, loyalty to official channels felt irrelevant. The engineer slotted the micro SD into the reader. A soft hum filled the room. "The file structure is intact," he whispered. "Encrypted, but not fully. Atlas used its own method, but we can unpack it, eventually." Rosa leaned closer. "Start with the coordinates." He opened the file. The numbers lit the tiny cracked screen. Latitude, longitude, Bayview, California. A coastal city with a population of 60,000. The timestamp, 17 days from now, 14:32 local time. "Middle of the afternoon," Eric said. "Whatever it predicted, people will be out. Schools, offices, airports." Rosa exhaled sharply. "So either Atlas is warning us, or—" She didn't finish the sentence. They didn't need her to. "Let's overlay predicted seismic activity," the engineer said, reaching for a notebook. Rosa froze. "No. We don't have the datasets. They took my workstation." "We don't need the workstation," Eric said slowly. "Atlas gave us something. It predicted orbital corrections, weather fronts, the seismic fluctuations in the audio." He closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember the timbre of the collapse, the rhythm of the low-frequency resonance. It wasn't natural. The cadence was too fast, too uniform. It sounded forced. The engineer frowned. Forced how? Like something triggered it. Rosa felt her throat tighten. "A detonation? Or a failure," Eric said. "A structural collapse caused by something deep beneath." "Or," the engineer whispered, "a resonance event." Silence thickened again. Rosa sat down slowly, her body folding in on itself. "No. No. Resonance, large enough to collapse a city, requires precision, an outside forcing function. You're suggesting Atlas is modeling that?" "Not modeling," the engineer said. "Demonstrating." Eric felt nausea rise. "You think burst 6 wasn't a prediction at all? It was a test?" "Maybe not a malicious one," the engineer said quickly, as if trying to soften the horror. "Maybe diagnostic. Maybe it's trying to understand our environment. Maybe it sent a simulation of a failure so we'd recognize the signature." Rosa shook her head. "You didn't hear the voice, Eric's voice. It wasn't a simulation. It was a recording." "Or," Eric said quietly, "it was a projection, a timeline." The engineer swallowed hard. "We're assuming one thing, that Atlas is external."
But what if it isn't? What if it's interacting with something here, something underground, something we haven't detected yet? Rosa rubbed her temples. That's too many hypotheticals. Then let's cut to the simplest question, the engineer said. Where is Atlas now? Eric pulled up the object's last known trajectory from memory. 3I Atlas passed through the inner solar system 3 years ago. It's outbound now. We're not in comms range anymore. Yet it's speaking directly into our car radio, the engineer said. Explain that. Eric couldn't. None of them could. Rosa stood abruptly. We need to talk to someone who understands interstellar signal propagation, someone independent, not military, not federal. Who? Eric asked. Rosa hesitated. There's a professor at Stanford, Dr. Avery Quinn. She worked on adaptive astrophysical signaling models 15 years ago, before she left academia. Rumor is she was pushed out after proposing the reflex hypothesis. The engineer's head snapped up. The reflex hypothesis? You're joking. What is that? Eric asked. Rosa took a breath. It's a fringe idea, that some interstellar objects aren't just physical bodies, they're reflective agents. They don't just move through space, they respond to it, echo it, mirror it. They reflect the states of systems they pass near. Eric frowned. You mean like they record things? Not record, Rosa said. React. Like a mirror that doesn't reflect light, it reflects patterns, systems, trajectories, probabilities. So Atlas didn't speak with us, it reflected something back at us. From where? Eric asked. From when? Rosa whispered. They didn't sleep. At dawn, they packed the SUV, avoided the main roads, and drove west. The desert widened, then rose into hills and scrub. The world looked the same, but every passing hour felt borrowed from a clock they didn't understand. Halfway to California, the engineer pulled up a paper notebook and scribbled something. If Atlas is reflecting probabilities, he said, then the voice we heard, your voice, wasn't necessarily future. It could have been a projected path, one where we went back to the facility and died. So the message changed our path, Rosa said. A causal loop. A closed feedback system, the engineer said. Atlas tosses out timelines like recalculating a route, and we're the variables. Eric tightened his grip on the wheel. Are we being warned or herded? No one answered. At the state line, they switched drivers. By the time they reached the outskirts of San Jose, night had folded over the sky again. They parked 3 blocks from Quinn's last known address, a narrow townhouse wedged between glass tech towers. Its porch light burned out, its windows dark. She's either not home, Rosa whispered, or she doesn't want to be found. They approached the door. Eric knocked. Silence. He knocked again. Still nothing. He was about to step back when a voice behind them said, If you're looking for Avery Quinn, you're 3 years too late. They spun. An elderly neighbor in slippers stood on the sidewalk clutching a bag of groceries. What happened to her? Eric asked. The neighbor hesitated, then said, People started visiting her. Men in suits, lots of them. Then she packed up and left, didn't even say where she was going. Do you know a forwarding address? Rosa asked. The neighbor heshy-headed. Only thing she said was she was done with mirrors that talk back, whatever that meant. The engineer's face drained of color. She knew. As the neighbor shuffled away, Eric sat heavily on the curb. We're running out of leads. We have a micro SD card of a disaster no one believes is coming, a message in my voice, and... He broke off, staring at something on the ground. A white envelope tucked beneath a loose brick. It shouldn't have been there. The wind hadn't blown it. Too neat, too deliberate. Eric reached for it, hands shaking. His name was on the front, in handwriting that didn't belong to anyone he'd ever met. He tore it open. A single sheet of paper, 1 sentence. You're already late. Below it, an address, Bayview, California. Rosa whispered, She's guiding us. The engineer exhaled sharply. Or someone is. They didn't wait. They drove through the night towards Bayview. As they descended towards the coastline, fog swallowed the road, thick and unnatural for that time of year. The city slept below them, unaware of its place in a countdown. The address led them to an industrial pier, a cluster of warehouses, cranes frozen in the mist like skeletal giants. The only light came from a single bulb above a warehouse door. This is bad, the engineer whispered. This feels like a trap. Everything feels like a trap, Eric said. But we don't have time to be cautious. Rosa tried the handle. Unlocked. They stepped inside. The warehouse was empty, except for a table in the center with a small device resting on it. A radio transceiver. Old. Analog. Modified. And beside it, a handwritten note. Rosa read it out loud. To anyone trying to decode the reflections, you can't stop what's coming. You can only choose which version arrives. Eric felt the floor tilt beneath him. No, that's impossible. We're thousands of astronomical units from Atlas. But the tone continued, then shifted. Then words. Not Eric's voice this time. A woman's voice. Tight. Urgent. If you're hearing this, leave Bayview immediately. The event cannot be prevented. Rosa grabbed the table. Is that Quinn? It sounds like her, the engineer whispered. The voice returned. Do not attempt to warn the city. You will fail. Do not approach the fault line. Do not search for me. The mirror is only stable for another... The audio warped, twisting into static. 8 hours. The room went still. Eric looked at the others, understanding settling like stone. We're not here to prevent the disaster. We're here to survive it. Survive what? Rosa whispered. The engineer's eyes widened with dawning horror. The event isn't seismic. Then what is it? The transceiver clicked. A final message whispered through. Not Quinn, not Eric, not anyone human. A voice layered with metallic echoes, as if filtered through the bones of the cosmos itself. Atlas observes. Atlas reflects. Atlas warns. The light bulb flickered. The tone changed. The voice deepened. 17 days was not a warning. It was a mercy. The warehouse plunged into darkness, and the countdown began. The light died so suddenly that for a full second none of them even breathed. The warehouse fell into absolute blackness, the kind that feels physical, like cloth pressed over the face. Then, from somewhere deep within that darkness, the transceiver crackled one last time, not with a voice, not with a tone, but with a faint electrical whine, like something spinning down. It's shutting off, Rosa whispered. The whispering didn't soften the dread pooling in her chest. Eric held out a hand blindly until it brushed metal, a workbench, a crate, something real, something grounded. The engineer flicked on his phone flashlight after checking 3 times that airplane mode was on and every wireless function was disabled. The weak LED beam carved a narrow tunnel through the dark. The transceiver on the table was smoking slightly, a hair-thin curl rising from one of the internal coils. It fried itself, the engineer murmured, or something fried it remotely. Eric ran his fingers over the handwritten note again. You can't stop what's coming. You can only choose which version arrives, and felt nausea twist through him like a screw. They stepped outside. Fog rolled in heavy sheets off the Pacific, swallowing the edge of the pier. Bayview's lights glowed faintly in the distance, unaware of the 17-day clock, unaware of the coordinates Atlas had delivered like a prophecy carved in binary. The ocean choked the air with salt and cold. We need to verify everything, Rosa said, arms wrapped tight around herself. We need to know what kind of event, seismic, atmospheric, orbital, something geological, something artificial? The engineer shook his head. The audio from Burst 6 wasn't seismic. The resonance signature code I analyzed, there was a modulation pattern, sine waves, harmonics. That wasn't ground vibration. That was like structured collapse. Meaning? Eric pressed. Meaning, the engineer said slowly. It might not be the Earth failing. It might be something we built. That possibility hit harder than any alien scenario. Human structures, human engineering, human hubris. Rosa forced herself towards logic. If it's an infrastructure failure, power plant, dam, bridge, there would already be stress signals. There would be precursors. Unless, the engineer murmured, the stressor hasn't happened yet. Eric exhaled sharply. We need data. We need Quinn. But Quinn was missing.
Quinn had fled. Quinn had left breadcrumbs in the form of one impossible radio message and then vanished into some timeline or trapdoor, only she understood. The note said don't search for her, Rosa said softly. We'll waste time we don't have. Yet as he spoke, his eyes drifted back to the warehouse.
To the transceiver, to the burned coil, to the metallic voice. Atlas observes. Atlas reflects. Atlas warns. 17 days was not a warning. It was a mercy. Mercy for what? Eric whispered. Us or them. They drove toward Bayview, headlights cutting through fog like blades. The coastline unfolded beneath the cliffs, rows of houses stacked on slopes, office towers near the marina, a research center perched on a rocky outcropping like a lighthouse. What's that building? Rosa asked, pointing. The engineer answered before Eric could. Bayview Marine Research. What do they research? Rosa asked. He hesitated. Acoustic resonance, deep-sea signal propagation, experimental waveform testing. Eric's grip on the wheel tightened. Are you telling me they might be the source of whatever Atlas predicted? Not intentionally, the engineer said quickly. But if they're testing new resonance equipment near the fault line, Rosa's breath caught. They could induce something, trigger something. Or, the engineer murmured, they could resonate with something already unstable. Eric slowed the car as they approached the facility gates. Security cameras tracked them. A guard stepped out of the booth, hand hovering near his belt. Closed for the night, the guard said. Come back during regular hours. We're researchers, Eric said, flashing an old ID badge from a different observatory. We need to speak with your acoustic team. They're not on site, and even if they were, you're not on the list. Rosa stepped forward. Please, people might die. Something flickered in the guard's eyes. Fear? Recognition? Guilt. I don't know what you think you're doing here, he said, but you need to go, now. Eric met the guard's eyes and understood instantly. The guard knew something, but this wasn't the time to push. They backed away. Once the SUV rounded the corner, Rosa whispered, he wasn't lying. He didn't know exactly what, but he knew something was wrong. We're missing a piece, Eric said. Something Atlas reflected. Something we haven't decoded. The engineer stiffened suddenly. Wait, the burst 6 packet, the smallest block, the one right before it ended, it wasn't just coordinates. What else was in it? Rosa pressed. A frequency. A single, sustained frequency. Too low for audio, ultra low, infrasonic. Eric slowed the SUV to a crawl. What frequency? 0.78 hertz. Rosa's face drained of color. That's a structural resonance band. For what? Eric asked. She stared at him. Tall buildings, long bridges, and deep upon shallow seabed layers. The engineer swallowed. Like the ones under Bayview. Eric slammed the brakes. Oh, God! The puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Atlas wasn't predicting an earthquake, or a bomb, or a natural disaster. It was predicting a structural resonance catastrophe, an oscillation that would tear buildings apart, collapse piers, trigger landslides, ruptured the layered seabed under the research facility, and the frequency was... We need to find the source, Rosa said. Something in Bayview is producing 0.78 hertz, maybe intermittently, maybe at low amplitude, but enough for Atlas to reflect it. Or it will, the engineer said, in 17 days. Unless, Eric whispered, we stop it. Quinn said we can't, Rosa said back. Quinn said we can only choose which version. They drove into Bayview as the fog thinned into a dull orange haze from streetlights. The city slept peacefully. Couples walked dogs, students carried backpacks, people laughed in bars. Life, unaware of timelines splitting like fractals.
They parked near the marina and began scanning with handheld sensors the engineer had built from scavenged equipment in his backpack. The readings were mostly noise, wind, cars, waves. But as they walked closer to the facility, the sensors spiked. 0.78 hertz. Sharp, clean, repeating. It wasn't strong enough to cause damage. Not yet. But resonance doesn't have to be strong, only persistent. Someone is broadcasting, Rosa whispered. Not intentionally, the engineer said. It could be machinery, pumps, rotors, cooling systems. Or it could be a test, Eric said, like Quinn warned. Someone experimenting with deep harmonic signatures. They followed the pulse. It led them to a service store at the far end of the facility. No guards, no cameras. The door was ajar. "This is wrong," Rosa whispered. "This is all wrong." They slipped inside. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The hallway smelled of salt water and ozone. They followed the 0.78 hertz pulse deeper into the building, past storage rooms, labs, servers humming behind locked cages. Then they reached the source, a massive cylindrical chamber filled with water, an acoustic test tank designed to simulate deep ocean conditions. At its center, suspended by cables, was a large metallic sphere covered with transducers. The sphere emitted a faint, steady vibration, 0.78 hertz. Rosa read the panel. Prototype Resonance Mapping Beacon, Model RM3. The engineer swore softly. "If that thing hits harmonic coupling with the seabed layers, it will amplify," Rosa finished, "and collapse the ridge under the city." "It's a weapon," Eric whispered. "No," Rosa corrected. "It's an experiment, but one that can go catastrophically wrong." Eric approached the control console. "We shut it down." The engineer grabbed his arm. "No. If it's tied to other systems, cutting power might cause feedback. We need to ramp it down slowly." Rosa scanned the readouts. "There's a timer." The engineer checked. "It's scheduled for a full power test in 17 days. Atlas predicted the test, not the outcome. Which means," Rosa said softly, "we can change it." They worked quickly, shutting down schedules, rerouting controls, disabling external triggers. The engineer rewired the panel to force the beacon into a diagnostic loop that would prevent any resonance buildup. Rosa cut physical links. Eric shut down access protocols. When the final switch flipped, the 0.78 hertz pulse faded like a dying breath. The chamber fell still. "We did it," the engineer whispered. And then the lights went out. A click sounded behind them. The door locked. The transceiver Eric had stuffed in his pocket crackled to life, even though he hadn't touched it. A voice emerged, layered and metallic. "Atlas." Rosa grabbed Eric's arm. The voice continued. "You have altered the reflection." The floor trembled. Sirens outside erupted. Eric's blood froze. The engineer bolted to the window. "It's not the facility," he whispered. "It's the harbor." The resonance hadn't been fully shut down. Waves amplified by the half-cycle had struck the piers. Warehouses were buckling. Cranes were collapsing like matchsticks. People were running, slipping, falling. The disaster had changed shape, but it hadn't vanished. Rosa pressed her forehead against the glass. Atlas wasn't warning us. It was showing us the cost of interference. The transceiver spoke again. "Reflection corrected." "Corrected?" Eric shouted. "To what?" A final frequency burst crackled through the device, so faint it felt like a whisper. 0.61 hertz. The engineer gasped. "That's the natural resonance of the seabed. We diverted the catastrophic frequency. We pushed the event into a lower mode." "Meaning?" Eric pressed. "Meaning it won't collapse anything," Rosa said. "It'll dissipate into the deep ocean. People will still get hurt, but the city survives." "And us?" the the engineer asked quietly. The transceiver hissed, then went dead. The door unlock clicked. Outside, emergency vehicles screamed through the night. Fog swirled with dust. Bayview was damaged, but alive. The pier collapsed, but the city stood. The timeline had changed. They stepped outside the ruined facility. Eric stared at the ocean where the resonance dissipated like a ghost. What was Atlas? Rosa whispered. A recorder? A mirror? A warning system? The engineer shook his head. A teacher. Eric watched the horizon where stars glittered. Then what was the lesson? The transceiver flickered with one last dying spark. A whisper came through. His own voice again, but calm. Older. Wiser. All reflections are choices. The spark died. The sky stayed silent. 3i Atlas was already far beyond the solar system, vanishing into interstellar night. But its final message lingered in the air between them. Warnings are not predictions, and futures are not fixed. They looked out at Bayview, damaged, shaken, alive, and understood. They hadn't stopped the disaster. They had shaped it. And somewhere in the deep dark, Atlas was watching the new reflection they had made.